Well, I have to talk a little about basketball. I actually don't like to generally, but, um, I played in high school and I played later, and I was a very good defender. I was a very good rebounder, 12 to 15 rebound a game kind of guy, and, kind of a streaky shooter. But the real issue was I hated to run. I could never understand human beings who wanted to run, who liked to run, who did it and thought they looked good. Maybe it was a hangover from, seventh and eighth grade when I was so tall. And you'd have to run in PE, and I always felt like I was so tall, I felt like a giraffe gambling across the savannah, and so, and even now when I'm out, all the walking I do, joggers come by, and it just makes no sense to me running if you aren't being chased. I always look behind them to see if there's a bear or something. And the greatest compliment I ever got was 25 years after I played in the Portland Interscholastic League, a buddy of mine took me to see a state quarterfinal game. I think the school I went to, Wilson, must have been playing in it or something. But I was up late the night before on shrooms, and I was very groggy, and it was a morning game, and I smoked some of my trademark 13th floor on the way over. I thought it'd maybe wake me up, but things just got worse. So we sat down, and my buddy was on one side of me, and then this other guy, a tall guy, was to my right. And, I kept nodding off during the game, but when I, sort of come to, this guy would be staring at me. And I thought, well, this is kind of fucking weird. And then I dozed off again, and all of a sudden, he's shaking my arm. And he said, and I look at him and he goes, "God damn it." He said, "I know who you are." And I said, "Yeah, what?" And he goes, "You're the guy who never ran. You're Park." And I said, "Oh," and he said, "I played for Grant." He said, "You graduated in 65, right?" And I said, yeah. And he said, "I played for Grant. My buddy and I were third string of the 12 guys, number 11 and number 12. We sat at the end of the bench. But we always loved when we played Wilson, because we'd watch you and try to figure out what you were doing on a varsity basketball team without ever running." And he said, "You did this thing where he said, we finally figured out, you did this thing where you'd grab the rebound and you toss it out to a guard and you take 3 quick steps like you were going to race down the court. But what you're really doing was waiting for everyone else to catch up. And as they did, you'd meld back into the crowd to the last guy, and then you'd sort of keep pace with him." And I said, "Oh, you remember that?" And he goes, "Absolutely." He said, you were the laziest athlete in America." I said, "Oh, thank you. Thank you very much." I said, "They always talk about the hustlers. What about the lazy guys?" And he goes, "Hey, I didn't mean it as a compliment, buddy." He said, "My buddy and I wondered, what the fuck did you do with your life? What do you do for a living?" I said, "Oh, I'm a pot grower." And he goes, "I should have known." And so I tell that because after those 2 jobs I spoke about earlier, the dinette and the cafeteria, I actually got a civilized job. Again, another girl I knew, her father managed Meyer and Frank, the big department store in Portland. So I worked in the sporting goods department at Lloyd Center, and I worked there 40 to 50 hours a week while I was going to Portland State. And it was a commission job. And, I don't generally say this, but it wasn't that bad a job. I did just enough that they wouldn't fire me, and that I would make enough to live on, which was, minimal at the time, because I wasn't drinking or anything yet. So it's a week before Christmas. And, I just put out a Galaxy cigarette, and I'm at the cash register, and this was a pivotal moment in my life. I turned around, and here comes Don Porter. Now, he was the coach at Tigard High School, which is a different league than ours. They're in the Portland area. And I'd watched his teams play once. He was famous for all his players sprinted all the time. And I say I watched him. I watched once for like 30 seconds, and it made me ill to watch. My God, what a, it was just like torturing children. And so he comes walking up, and he's my height, and he's twice as wide. He's a giant guy with these big mitts, and he sticks out his hand, and he goes, "Steve, I'm Don Porter. I used to be the coach at Tiger." And I said, yeah, I remember you, Don. I said, how you doing? And he said, well, I'm here to offer you a scholarship. He said, I am now the head coach at the Lower Columbia College, Community College in Longview, Washington, and I couldn't believe that you're not playing for someone. And, I'd like to offer you a scholarship. I'd like you to play for me. I said, no way, Jose. I said, are you kidding me? I said, and he said, well, what do you mean? I said, I saw your team play. I said, it made me sick. I said, listen, I was really disappointed in this guy. He was the kind of guy, this kind of well-known coach. I thought he was a better judge of talent than to be there recruiting me. I figured this guy had to be pretty goddamn desperate. And I said, look, I think basketball should be a very slow, choreographed game that concentrates on execution. I said, kind of like a ballet. And he says, ballet, and he leans over and smacks me on the back. I thought he broke my spine. I went, oh, fuck. And he says, I talked to your old coach. He said, whatever you do, don't recruit that guy. He said, he's the biggest wiseacre on earth. And he said, ballet, you'll run when you play for me. I said, get this to your head. I'm not going to play for you. And he said, why? What do you got going on here? And, that was the first time I thought, well, like everyone that was, 1965, the whole thing was the draft. That's why I was in Portland State. That's why I worried about how many credits I took. If you dropped out of school, you're immediately drafted and sent off to Nam, which I had a pretty good idea I wouldn't be a great soldier. And I hated, if I never saw Oregon, that was fine. And I didn't like Portland State, especially that language lab, as I talked about. So I said, well, okay. I said, just for conversation's sake, what does this scholarship entail? And he said, well, tuition and fee waiver and a good work study job. And I said, yeah. And he said, plus for you, a special bonus. He said, they just built a volunteer firehouse on the outskirts of town, and you will be the first and only resident. Volunteer firemen will be there sometime during the day, but it'll be totally your place. And he said, free rent. And I didn't tell him I was paying at the time $5 a month to live in a whorehouse, And but here's the thing, and this is why it's a pivotal moment in my. It's the first time I began to see the pattern. My basic DNA blueprint, as it was, which is. The worst thing I could think of was living in a firehouse around a bunch of red-hot gearheads that were somewhere near an engine, I'm sure would talk about nothing else. I was the most mechanically disinclined person that I've ever met or heard of. And the only thing I could think of that was worse than that was playing basketball for that guy. It'd be pure torture. And as that started going through, I thought, which means I can't resist. It was the worst idea I think of, so I can't resist. I'm going to be cremated, but if I had a tombstone, it'd say, why not? Like I talked to you when my mother would say, don't dare that guy. So I said, okay, I'm in. And he goes, really? You're not going to stick to your principles more than that? I knew it was going to be so bad with this guy. I said, yeah, I'm in. I want the scholarship. And so he reached over with his right hand and shook mine. And with his left, he snaked his hand into my pocket up here, pulled out my pack of, Galaxy cigarettes and made a point of crushing them. He said, "You won't be needing these anymore." And I said, "Wait, save me the coupon."